Oh hi, I didn't see you there. Here's a question for you. Why didn't J.R.R. Tolkien write The Lord of the Rings as a series of blog posts?
And I know what you're gonna say. Because the internet didn't exist back then, Todd. I know that. Stop trying to be clever. You know what I mean. Why didn't he write it as an article in a magazine, or a journal entry, or an essay? Why did he have to write this super long series instead of just writing something more succinct? Also, my name's not Todd. I mean, seriously, look at this. This series is 3 books long, which is nothing by the standards of modern fantasy books, but still, cumulatively, it's over 1,000 pages. There's so many songs, so many poems. There's like 100 pages of Hobbiton politics before we even get into the main story. Wouldn't the story have been just as powerful if we just got a TLDR? Now, all of these probably sound like stupid questions, and there's a good reason for that, which is that they're stupid questions. But I want to just take them seriously for a moment, because I think trying to answer these questions seriously is illuminating of a certain attitude I see towards books and storytelling in general sometimes online. For example, I saw this post on Twitter the other day, which I will not be linking to because I have zero interest in dunking on individual people, and also you shouldn't go on Twitter, it's a horrible website. But anyway, I saw this post and it read, "I don't know what people learn from novels and poems that isn't more rigorously exposited and defended in philosophy texts." Now, the only reason I'm drawing attention to this post in particular is because I think it is illustrative of this idea that I'm talking about concerning how we think about books and storytelling. Namely, that the core purpose of storytelling is to convey messages or gesture towards messages that could, in theory, be just as easily, if not more easily, explained in the form of philosophy texts, or blog posts, or essays, or whatever. This idea that the purpose of fiction is strictly to convey messages or morals for the purpose of self-edification reaches its zenith in this ad I saw the other month, which purports to simplify complicated books and make them easier to read. Except by complicated books, they're not talking about Ulysses, they're talking about The Great Gatsby, which is like a standard book that most people read in high school. Excuse me for just a second. Look, last month I made that video where I was talking about how I was an English major, and now I have a little goblin inside of me that's like the English major aspect of myself, and every once in a while I have to let that little goblin run free. So just allow me to indulge myself here a little bit. This general attitude we have that the purpose of books is to communicate messages is even reflected in the way that we talk about books here on BookTube. Everybody has a TBR that's like 1,000 books long, and we feel guilty for not reading books that are on our TBR, not because we necessarily want to read them, but because we want to have read them. We want to have them under our proverbial belt. I feel embarrassed that there's a lot of classic books I've never read. I've never read Pride and Prejudice. When people make thirst trap edits of Mr. Darcy, I have no idea what they're going on about. I should have read that book by now. What am I doing? Okay, but you know what? Let's go back for a second. Let's suppose that this is actually the reason Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, that he was just trying to convey a few core messages that could, in theory, have been easily summarized in a blog post. What might these messages have been? Well, they might have been something like, ordinary people can make an enormous difference even in a world that's incredibly vast and confusing. Evil inevitably capitulates to its own hubris and can only destroy the work of good while unable to create beauty on its own accord. Humans are fickle creatures who will often make compromises with evil in pursuit of power rather than stand up against it. Even in the darkest of times, we ought never to forget the importance of showing pity and mercy even to our enemies, and so on. There's loads of opinions about this, but let's just pretend for a moment that these are the core points that Tolkien was trying to get across in a series, whether consciously or even unconsciously. The question remains then, if he was trying to make these points, why didn't he just make them? Well, this is probably a bad example because he did make these points in private letters and other correspondences, but ignoring that for a second, why did he bother writing this entire series just to make these points? Now look, before I get into the meat of this, I should say there's like 2,000 years of philosophy on this very subject. What is the purpose of storytelling? And I'm not going to pretend like I've read all of it or am going to summarize all of it. These are basically just my own thoughts after having done a little bit of reading and a little bit of research on this subject. And those of you who have read The Critique of Pure Reason or whatever and think that it offers novel insights into this question, feel free to input your own suggestions in the replies. Anyway, to start with, I think there is one obvious benefit that stories have over essays or blog posts or whatnot, which is that they have much stronger mimetic fitness. So what in the world do I mean by that? Basically, the human brain seems to be structured in such a way where it is easier for us to remember stories than it is to remember brute facts. I honestly have no idea where the term mimetic fitness originates, but I assume it comes from thinking of memes, or ideas, as existing in a social ecosystem similar to organisms in a natural ecosystem. Just as organisms in a natural ecosystem with greater fitness might outcompete organisms with lesser fitness, ideas in a social ecosystem with greater mimetic fitness might outcompete ideas with lesser mimetic fitness. And it seems like stories are really good at getting passed down from generation to generation to generation and surviving while other ideas die off. And this goes all the way back to ancient times, right? A lot of philosophers and authors of religious texts made the points they were trying to make in the form of stories simply because it was easier for humans to remember stories. It's one thing to tell a child that you shouldn't lie because it might make you seem like an untrustworthy person, and it's another thing entirely to tell them the story of the boy who cried wolf. In fact, in this particular case, it seems so much more effective that the phrase cried wolf has worked its way into our collective vocabulary to describe a person who is deemed as being particularly untrustworthy. Now look, I'm not a psychologist, I can't explain why this is the case necessarily, but it seems intuitive to me. Maybe we like to read epics because they allow us to experience the wide range of emotions we might experience over the course of an entire life in a much shorter amount of time, similar to the idea of catharsis that Aristotle proposed. Maybe we like to read dialogues because we're social organisms and reading dialogue makes us feel like we're eavesdropping on another person's conversation, and maybe we're more likely to remember that kind of information. Or maybe, maybe we prefer stories to philosophy just because for most people, reading pages and pages and pages of straight up philosophy is kind of confusing and boring. It doesn't seem like, for most of us, that style of information is what we're adapted to consuming. Now, of course, some caveats here. There are a ton of different ways to structure stories, and every time somebody comes up with a universal story structure, like the monomyth, for example, I tend to be kind of skeptical of it because it seems like there are more ways to structure stories than there are cultures that tell stories. But still, the basic idea that a story is a narrative of fictional events taking place over a certain amount of time, and that these narratives can convey messages that we're trying to convey and make it easier to remember those messages, that seems basically universal. The other thing, though, is that, of course, these types of stories I'm describing here are not necessarily always the types of stories that we consider the best stories. Of course, we have the timeless classics like Aesop's fables and Plato's dialogues and so on, but nowadays, in modern fiction, we oftentimes agree that if an author gets too carried away with using their story as a vessel for a specific message, it gets kind of obnoxious and annoying. Nowadays, if an author is good, we often expect them to deliver the message of the story through subtext. Oftentimes, this only contributes to the mimetic fitness of the idea, because if we have to do a little bit of work to discover it for ourselves, then we have the memory of thinking through it, along with the memory of the story itself. And as a whole, it just feels a little bit more rewarding if a story leaves us with some hunting final images or mysteries to ponder that we can think about in the coming days as we reflect on what we experience. But the thing is, there's a trade-off here, because the more you try to convey your messages through subtext, the greater the possibility that people are going to misinterpret those messages. And if you think about the diverse range of experiences that people have and the different biases they might bring to a given book, you realize that it's almost impossible to convey a message in a way that will be understood by literally everybody. There's always going to be some fraction of the population who's going to completely miss the point. It's like that one Paul Verhoeven quote about Starship Troopers, which, as far as I can tell, isn't necessarily an actual quote that he said, but which is still illustrative. He supposedly said, "I want to make a movie so painfully obvious in its satire that everyone who understands it lives in perpetual psychological torment inflicted on them by all the people who don't." Starship Troopers, for those who are not aware, is a film that is supposed to be a pastiche of fascist propaganda. This is fairly obvious to most people who watch the first 5 minutes of the movie, but still there are a lot of people who seem to miss this element of the film. And so you might ask, if Paul Verhoeven was trying to convey the message that fascism is bad in this movie, why didn't he just write a blog post called "Fascism is Bad"? Is he really doing a better job of conveying the core message of the film if the people who were just going to take the propaganda within the universe of the film at face value anyway simply take the pastiche at face value as well? And so it seems like we're coming up against one of the core problems with the idea that stories are primarily a means of communicating information. Stories are simply an incredibly lossy way of communicating information. Their mimetic advantages often come at the expense of accuracy and applicability to the real world. But what if, here's a thought, what if, for some storytellers, that was actually the point? Because you see, the best stories, insofar as they're trying to convey any message at all, oftentimes aren't trying to convey the very straightforward, simple messages you might get in Aesop's fables. Oftentimes, it's a lot more vague than that. It certainly seems to be the case that many artists and storytellers lean into the ambiguity of themes within fiction in order to make it a feature rather than a bug, that people get different meanings from it, that different people have different interpretations. For example, in an interview, the late great David Lynch, rest in peace, explained it like this: "Some of these ideas are more abstract than others, but we have this beautiful thing called intuition, and abstractions exist way more in real life. We use this intuition to get a sense of things, to find the truth of something." And it's not just filmmakers who do this, but also philosophers. For example, take this book by Jean-Paul Sartre, Nausea. Jean-Paul Sartre was one of the famous existentialists, which was a philosophical and artistic movement in the 20th century that has a lot of different, very vaguely defined components. But one of its core features, at least to me, seems to be the focus it places on the individual experience of humans, as opposed to abstract philosophical arguments. It concerns itself with the sort of things that we might encounter in our daily lives, the way we interface with the world and understand it. This book takes the form of a diary written by a man who suddenly realizes that he has become disgusted by his own existence. Every day is like a waking nightmare for him. He becomes acutely aware of the passage of time, and he just becomes overwhelmingly bored and filled with dread and despair. And it's easy to look at a book like this and try to pathologize the main character's condition, to say, well, this is a book about depression or melancholia or something like that. But is it? Because I think that trying to summarize it in a sentence like this really does the book a disservice. In order to understand it, you kind of have to read it for yourself. Oftentimes with the best novels, any attempt to summarize the novel will feel insufficient or vague at best. There's not really much of a plot hook here. You just have to take the leap and experience it for yourself. The reason I bring this book up is because in Nausea, Sartre is clearly trying to express something that is kind of inexpressible. He's trying to communicate a philosophical idea that he couldn't in any other way. And if you look at the way many of these artists describe their creative process, they seem in a lot of cases to be aware that they're trying to write something that is fundamentally unsummarizable. For example, of his creative process, Vladimir Nabokov once said, "I happen to be the kind of author who, in starting to work on a book, has no other purpose than to get rid of that book, and who, when asked to explain its origin and growth, has to rely on such ancient terms as interreaction and combination, which, I admit, sounds like a conjurer explaining one trick by performing another." I will admit that as an aspiring artist, I used to hate when authors talked this way. Why can't you just describe your creative process? Why are you, clearly a very smart individual, incapable of describing the steps that you took to write a book? Why are you incapable of describing what you were trying to say? Are all of these great authors purposefully trying to obfuscate their process in order to make it harder for other authors to write books? Is there some grand conspiracy going around where authors are purposefully trying to mythologize the writing process? Now look, in some cases I think it is possible to get a little obnoxious about this mystical description of the creative process. But also it might be worth considering that the creative process and the core themes of a work of fiction can, in some cases, exist in such a way where the very act of trying to describe them necessarily dilutes their meaning. I don't know, I'm just saying stuff here. Honestly, sometimes I find this kind of infuriating. It's philosophically unsatisfying to just say that there is some thing about fiction that can't be explained, that is there, but we just sort of have to believe it's there because we can't describe it or explain it. It's basically an unfalsifiable claim, which is super annoying. But sometimes, while I'm reading a book, I truly do feel like I am coming to understand something that I could not have come to understand any other way, that can only be understood through experiencing the thing itself. And maybe it's okay to just accept that, even though it's infuriating. But hold on. I still think there's one piece of the puzzle missing here, like one reason why we might tell stories that has nothing to do with conveying any sort of message or any sort of information at all. After all, explaining a book like Nausea as being purposefully abstract in order to lead audience members to coming to different conclusions, that's one thing. But how do we explain, say, the 50 pages of Hobbit lore at the beginning of Lord of the Rings? In the prologues of the Lord of the Rings, when Tolkien is going on and on about pipeweed lore, do you think he's trying to lead the reader to intuit some deep point about the economics of tobacco in provincial England? Do you think he created some of the most sophisticated and advanced conlangs in the world at the time simply to illustrate to his philology students some point about the evolution of languages or how words influence our understanding of concepts? No. I mean, that might have been a side thing, but I think the main reason he did all of this is because it's fun. Now look, as I said at the beginning of this video, there are a lot of different theories out there for why we tell stories. One of those theories is the hedonistic theory of art, which is that the purpose of art is simply to bring us pleasure. And this often gets passed off as a kind of reductionistic explanation for art. And I would tend to agree. I don't think the purpose of art is simply to bring us pleasure, especially if we're talking about pleasure in a very naive sense, where even a slightly challenging work gets passed off as having no artistic merit because it's hard to get through. But I still do think that having fun is one of the main reasons we tell stories. Because we don't need 50 pages of Shire lore and Hobbiton politics. We don't need lengthy appendices listing every ruler who ever ruled Numenor. We don't need any of that. But we like it, some of us anyway, because it's fun. And of course, here we return to the same problem that I was discussing earlier, which is that there are so many different types of people, and some people will think one thing is fun, some people will not think another thing is fun. And you know what? That's fine. That's totally fine. At the end of the day, even though it is the job of literary critics to judge the value of art and to rank one work of art as being higher than another work of art, when it comes down to individual taste, taste is ineffable. Maybe a successful story, a highly mimetically contagious story, is simply a story that an abnormally large number of people found to be incredibly fun. I don't know. Maybe. So anyway, why does any of this even matter? Like, a lot of what I've been saying in this video seems so banal and obvious. Why am I waffling on about it? Why did I make a whole video about this? Well, one reason is because, as I was saying earlier, I wanted to push back against this pragmatic theory of fiction. I wanted to push back against this idea that if we can't explain why stories are important, we ought to stop making them. Maybe we should just accept that they're important. It's certainly interesting to ask ourselves why stories might stick in our head longer than blog posts do, but at the end of the day, people who like to do certain things are going to do those things. And nothing needs to change that. You don't have to fight human nature just because you can't explain it. But I also think there's a second reason I wanted to make this video, which is that I think the idea that the primary purpose of stories is simply to communicate messages, to convey information, I think this idea is not only wrong, but dangerous. And that's because if we think that this is what the purpose of stories is, we might start to get our information about the real world from stories. And that's a bad thing. Stories can inspire us and motivate us and bring us joy, and they can elucidate some things that can't be explained through strict philosophy texts. But I don't think we should get carried away with letting stories form our entire worldview. Anyway, nothing I've said in this video is even going to matter if you just take my word for it. Because if it is true that there are certain things that stories can teach you that can't be explained in any other way, then you have to read those stories in order to get those things. So go read a book. Or write a book. And if you do want to write a book, then you might be interested in checking out a course I've been taking recently called Creative Writing Bootcamp, Start a Brand New Story, offered by today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an enormous online community made for creatives by creatives, with a wide range of different courses in such topics as illustration, design, productivity, creative writing, film, music, sound, anything you could imagine. The great thing about these classes is that you get access not only to video lectures, but also to a large online creative community who can see and critique your work. For example, in the creative writing class I mentioned, you can check out hundreds of different projects submitted by other students who have taken the class, read them all, comment, and share your own work. Whatever creative or professional pursuit you might be interested in, I think there will be something of interest to you on Skillshare. And if you are interested in checking out Skillshare, then go check the link in my description, because the first 500 people to click that link will receive 1 month of Skillshare absolutely free. If that sounds interesting to you, then get started today. Anyway, I have very little else to say. I would love to know what your theories are about why we tell stories, or what the importance of fiction is, or what a particular story meant to you. I don't know. I have to say that in these long-form talking videos, I am consistently blown away by the quality of the comments in the comments section. I think you all are a lot smarter and more eloquent than I am sometimes. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Read books, live life, and have a nice day. See you next time. Bye.